Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mondays with Mike. It is Monday, and it's, July 10th, and I want to thank you for joining me here at 12:30 each Monday afternoon. I want to talk about a few things with you today. First of all, I hope you had a good 4th of July, all that stuff. Everything worked out fine. You know, the rain that we had cleared out in time for the fireworks. We had a nice time, didn't get bit by any mosquitoes. The highlight of the 4th of July was not the fireworks themselves, but the fact that we found a frog on the ground. And my nephews, who are 6 and 3, were very, very interested in the frog. And especially the fact that I'm not scared to pick up frogs. So I picked up the frog. Actually, it was in the bed of my brother-in-law's truck. But I picked it up and it kind of, it subsequently ended up on the ground, but they were fascinated with this thing. And so I pick it up and show it to them. And meanwhile, fireworks are going off all over the place. And they really didn't care about the fireworks as much as they did the frog. So that was, so that was our adventure. So there's a couple of things that I want to talk about with you this week. Has to do with the tropics and another news story that came down over the last few days. So the two main stories are, the one is that the researchers from Colorado State University have now increased their expectation for storms this season, for the number of storms this season. And then the second thing I wanted to touch on briefly was this article, well, not just article, but series of articles that was done on a press release from the University of Maine about the warmest days ever recorded. So we'll talk about that. You probably heard that. This was, Monday, July 3rd was the warmest day ever, and the July 4th was the warmest day ever. Is that true? Let's put that in some context. Well, we'll check it out here in just a second. First thing I wanted to hit was the Colorado State forecast and the fact that they have now upped or increased their anticipated number of storms. So there are a lot of questions about this, right? The first question that I get a lot is, what do people in Colorado know about hurricanes? Yes, on the surface, that sounds like a reasonable question, but here's the deal. The reason why this tropical forecast comes out of Colorado State is that it was started by Dr. Bill Gray, William M. Gray, who he was an OG. He was an old school meteorologist from the University of Chicago, graduated there, got his PhD in the 1960s. He's the one that really pioneered these seasonal forecasts, and he took a professorship position at Colorado State. And so therefore the work continued, and his graduate students and so forth continued out of Colorado State University. So it would be like, if you think about it this way, we live in Houston, and a professor at the University of Houston, I'm sure there are many, who are experts in earthquakes, because you're a geologist and you're an expert in earthquakes. It doesn't mean that we get earthquakes here, And so for somebody to say, well, this person lives in Houston, what do they know about earthquakes? You know what I mean? It just doesn't, you could know a ton about hurricanes and not necessarily live where hurricanes hit. So that's the deal on that. And by the way, Bill Gray passed away in 2016, I think. He was a really, really nice guy. I had a chance to meet him a couple times. And the person who's taken his place is Phil Klotzbach, who's the head of their forecasting unit. So I'll read you what they said in their latest outlook, which is, we have increased our forecast and now call for an above average Atlantic Basin hurricane season in 2023. Remember, before the season, it was supposed to be average or slightly below average, right? Although uncertainty in this outlook is larger than normal, while we continue to anticipate a robust El Nino for the peak of hurricane season, Atlantic hurricane season, most of the tropical and subtropical Atlantic now has record warm sea surface temperatures. Record. It's a big deal. El Nino typically does increase wind shear across the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic, but the extreme anomalous warmth, how do you like that for a phrase? Extreme anomalous warmth in the tropical and subtropical Atlantic may counteract some of the typical El Nino driven increase in vertical wind shear. And I'll explain this in a minute. The probability of U.S. major hurricane landfall is estimated to be above the long-term average. As is the case with all hurricane seasons, coastal residents are reminded that it only takes one, blah, 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 blah. We always tell you that. So what does all this mean? Well, there are three main factors that they consider for their July update, which is what this was. One is the status of what we call ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So are we in an El Nino or a La Nina? Well, the last 3 hurricane seasons we were in a La Nina. Now we're in an El Nino phase. You have very warm water in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Peru and Ecuador. That tends to cut down the number of hurricanes. In fact, on average, it cuts them in half. With nothing else taken into consideration, none of these other anomalous water temperatures that I'm going to talk about here in a second. Just taking into account a strong El Nino, it cuts the average number of storms in half. So it's a big deal. But the 2 other things that they look at are water temperatures that are located in the Atlantic. So water temperatures in the central Atlantic, near the equator, and also water temperatures that are out in the far eastern Atlantic by the Cape Verde Islands. Both of those are so above average that it's almost off the charts. It is a bathtub, not just in the Gulf of Mexico, but all across the Atlantic Ocean. So that's why they're saying there's so much uncertainty as to what's going to happen this year. On the one hand, you've got the strong El Nino, you'd say fewer storms. You've got this incredibly warm Atlantic Ocean, you would think more storms. And in my opinion, what often happens is these things happen in flurries. So once you get the vertical shear, which is increased by the El Nino, meaning the winds kind of blow off the top of the storms, prevent them from growing. If that calms down for a couple of weeks, then you'll get hurricanes forming. And sometimes it may just be a brief window and you'll get a ton of hurricanes for a little while, and then the shear will either kick back in or you'll have some Saharan dust blow in, which has also been the case. In fact, it's the case out there right now. So we have a few competing things going on this hurricane season, which is why I expect it to be, people say, well, what do you think about this hurricane season? I expect it to be a weird one. That's what I anticipate. I really do. So comparing to average, average is going to be 14, 7, and 3. 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. And they are now forecasting 18, 9, and 4. Oh, the other logical question now is, does that count the storms that have already formed? Yes. So we've already had Arlene, Brett, Cindy. So that's 3 down. There was a preseason oddball storm that formed off the east coast of the U.S. that got classified as an unnamed tropical storm. So we've actually had 4. So when they talk about 18 storms, they're talking about 14 more because we've already had 4. But since we haven't had any hurricanes, they're still talking about 9 more hurricanes. So that's what's going on with that. And by the way, they do try to make an estimate too as to which part of the coastline is more at risk. And the Gulf Coast, and this goes from the Florida Panhandle all the way to Brownsville, Texas, has a 32% chance of a major hurricane landfall. That's something to be concerned about, right? So we're talking about category 3, 4, or 5. There's about a 1 out of 3 chance somewhere from the Florida Panhandle to Brownsville that they get a strike this year. And as is almost always the case, if a storm hits to the south of us, Corpus Christi, Brownsville, then we can get some of the consequences from it in terms of heavy rain. If it hits off to the east, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, typically its effects on our area are minimal. All right, finally, I wanted to get to the story that came out about the hottest day ever. I think that it was not inaccurate for the various news agencies to report this, for us to report it either. It wasn't inaccurate. It's just that you're taking a very, very complicated subject and a complicated set of tools that these forecasters have, and you're kind of turning it into a 30-second story. So here's the deal. So was it the warmest day ever? No, of course it was not the warmest day ever. The Earth has been here for a long time. Here's the deal. So researchers from the University of Maine, okay, they have a climate change institute at the University of Maine, and they do what is called a reanalysis where, and I took a graduate course where we did some of this, and it's actually really neat. You can take, so every day we have our computer models that we show you, like our GFS model. We use to track hurricanes, we use it to track cold fronts, and in fact, it's global. You can use it to track weather at the poles, you could look at Siberia, you could look at India, anywhere all over the world. It is creating a model of the atmosphere at that moment. So obviously now, 2023, we're inputting a lot of information, millions of points of information into that model. Like what kinds of information? Well, every temperature sensor that we have at every airport around the world, okay? All the humidity levels, all of the wind speeds, all the pressure, data coming from airplanes all over the world, from ships all over the world, from buoys in the ocean. I mean, just you can imagine the amount of data that goes into the GFS model and its European counterpart is just incredibly vast. But what you can do is called a reanalysis or a reanalyzer. And what that means is you can go back. Let's say you go back to today's July 10th. So let's say we want to look at July 10th, 1960. Well, how in the world could we look at July 10th, 1960? Well, we can use the model to help us. And so we take all of the data that we have from July 10th, 1960. And that could be thousands of points of data, tens of thousands, I'm not exactly sure, but you're talking about taking every temperature measurement that was available on that day, at that moment, even though it was many years ago, we still have that data, right? So you can take that data, plug it into the model, and then it will model you the atmosphere of what the Earth was like on that day. And so then based on that, you can go back and reanalyze the atmosphere. That's why it's called a reanalysis. And so that's how they compare, July 3rd, 2023 to what happened July 3rd, 1983, or July 3rd, 1963. So you can do that. Is it 100% accurate? No, of course not. And they fully admit that. They say these numbers are preliminary. They have to be sort of certified, given, I guess, a stamp of approval, if you will, by NOAA, and they haven't done that yet. Although this Climate Change Institute there at the University of Maine, they know what they're doing, and they work closely with the University Center for Atmospheric Research, which is called UCAR. So is it a big deal? It is. It's difficult to explain, as you can see here, in the context of like a 30-second news story. It'd be difficult, but it is interesting to read up on and about how they do it. It's pretty cool stuff. So anyway, those were two things I wanted to pass along to you. I want to thank you so much again for joining me here on Mondays with Mike. I want to give a shout out to my mom and my brother, who are the only ones who watch all the way through. So I appreciate that. And if you ever have any questions for me, you can message me through, and I try to get to all the messages. You can message me through Instagram or Facebook. My email address is mike.iskovits@fox.com. mike.iskovits@fox.com. If you ever want me to answer questions, if I get some good questions, I love to answer them here on Mondays with Mike. So I hope you have a great day. See you next week.